Tennessee Creepiness by Number Economy 8518. I was in my last year before retiring from the Army and was going through a pretty bad divorce. My soon-to-be ex returned to Texas with my two girls, and I planned to move closer to them once my retirement was official. I rented a small, 2-bedroom apartment in Tennessee in a small town called Indian Mound. Indian Mound was One night I came home around 1 in the morning from a concert in Nashville. It was early spring and it was somewhat foggy out. The driveway dipped down and the house was about an 1/8 mile from the road. As I pulled in, I saw a huge black dog standing in the front yard, and it looked like a black lab or a lab mixed breed. It stood with its head up and its tail straight up. It was fixated on me. I slowly pulled my car up, unsure of what to do next. When it turned and ran into the swamp, I didn't think much of it and went inside. Over the following few months, things started happening at night. I would always wake up around 3 or so in the morning, thinking I heard voices outside my window. And sometimes it sounded like someone or a couple of people were whispering to each other, but I couldn't quite understand what they were saying. Sometimes I would hear footsteps and movement outside. I thought it was maybe a deer or some sort of dog, or perhaps even the dog I saw earlier. But when I looked out, I saw absolutely nothing. This type of stuff continued for months. One night, I woke up to a noise and saw it was 2:57. A bright white light shone through the porch glass doors. I ran out into the kitchen and looked through the small sink window, and it looked like someone was out in the swamp shining a spotlight. It was one of those high-powered lights used in search and rescue. It was blinding and lit up the entire kitchen. I opened the back doors and ran onto the porch. I was yelling that I was calling the cops and to get out of here. The light suddenly went out and I heard someone moving away from the house through the swamp. The cops eventually came out, took a report, and told me to keep my doors locked and to call if anyone else came around or if anything else happened. I was hyper-vigilant from that day on, and sometimes I still am. I checked behind me when I was coming and going, and always slept with the shades drawn and doors locked. The footsteps around the house continued, and some nights I thought I could hear a dog panting outside my window, although I never found tracks or any signs of an animal in the morning. Things eventually did die down after a while, and I was about 3 months away from the end of my lease. I woke up around 3 in the morning, scared out of my mind, not really knowing why, honestly. I was sleeping fairly well and heard a woman calling my name in my dream out of nowhere. I opened my eyes and realized it was just a nightmare when I heard the voice call my name again, clear as day. I shot up out of my bed and turned on the lights. I checked in the closet and under the bed and every which way, every nook and cranny of the house. I opened the bedroom door and listened out in the hallway. I couldn't hear anything and was about to cut the light and return to bed when someone started pounding on my front door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was like someone was bashing the door with a sledgehammer. I yelled out that I had a gun and to get the hell off my property. I said I would call the cops and I'll blow your freaking head off before they get here. The pounding stopped. Cops came out again and took another report, but there was no visible damage to the door or footprints around the property. It all just stopped after that. I did actually buy a 9mm, but the rest of my time renting there was actually very peaceful. I'm back in Texas now, in an apartment complex in the suburbs, but I really don't mind. The backwoods of Tennessee were a creepy place. Never Solo Hike in the South by Anonymous. I've always loved hiking, especially solo hikes where I can lose myself in nature and forget about the rest of the world for some time. So when I had a chance to take a week off of work and explore the rural South, I jumped at the opportunity. I packed my backpack with all the essentials: water, food, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I also brought my tent and a sleeping bag in case I wanted to camp out for a night or two. The first few days were actually quite amazing. I walked through lush forest and along winding streams, spotting wildlife and enjoying the peacefulness of the woods. But on the 4th day, everything changed. I was walking along a narrow trail and I heard a very odd noise, to say the least. It sounded like a mix between a growl and a grunt, coming from somewhere just up ahead on the trail. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I've heard stories of bears, wild boars, and all that stuff in the area, but I've never encountered one before. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I slowly reached for my bear spray, but the noise stopped before I could even take it out of my pocket. I waited for a couple of minutes, but nothing seemingly happened. I shrugged it off as my imagination and kept on walking. As I continued down the trail, I noticed that the woods around me seemed different. The trees were twisted and gnarled, and the leaves on the ground were blackened and dead. The air was thick with an overpowering smell like rotten eggs mixed with something that I couldn't quite place. I tried to shake off this feeling of unease and kept walking, but when I heard the noise again, closer this time, I spun around, but there was absolutely nothing there. Just the empty trail behind me and the twisted trees ahead. I started to walk a bit faster, my heart starting to pick up in pace. The noise kept getting louder, closer, and more frequent. I felt like something, or someone was watching me, following me. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Finally, I just couldn't take it anymore. I broke into a run, my backpack bouncing on my back. The noise was now a constant, deafening roar that filled my ears and made my head spin. I felt like I was going insane. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything had stopped. I collapsed into the ground, gasping for breath. The woods around me were silent and the air smelled fresh again. I don't know how long I laid there, but when I finally stood up, I knew I had to get the heck out of here. I hiked back as fast as possible to my car, never looking back one time. I didn't stop until I was safely back into civilization. To this day, I don't know what happened to me in those woods, but I'll never forget that feeling of terror and helplessness, alone in the dark woods of the rural South. Urban Exploration Nightmares by Steph G3. I'm still trying to figure out why I agreed to go on this urban exploration trip with my friends in the first place. It could have been the excitement of exploring somewhere new or some crazy abandoned place or breaking the rules, I guess, but whatever it was, I regret it now as we made our way to an abandoned asylum in the middle of rural Alabama. The hospital was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense trees and overgrown vegetation. It had been left for years to rot, and nature started reclaiming the building. My friends and I had to push through the vines and thorns even to get to the entrance. The temperature dropped as soon as we entered inside, and an eerie silence settled over us. The hospital was dark, and the only light came from the flashlights that we were holding. The floorboards creaked under our feet and echoed through the empty halls. We explored the first few floors, and everything seemed normal. But as we made our way to the upper levels, things started to get very creepy. The air felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by something. The hospital was full of old medical equipment, furniture, and strange symbols and graffiti. We found ourselves in a room with an old operating table in the center. The table was covered in rust, and the tools on the tray next to it looked like they had actually been used recently though. The walls were covered in recent, strange symbols in writing that had definitely only been there a few weeks at most. The room was unusually cold. Suddenly, we began to hear footsteps coming from the hallway. We froze, unsure of what to do. The footsteps grew louder and we heard a low chanting behind the door. My friends wanted to investigate, but I wanted to avoid sticking around to find out what was going on the other side of that door. I grabbed one of their flashlights and started to make my way back down the stairs. But as soon as I walked through the dark and creepy hospital, I realized I was not alone. I could hear something breathing behind me, and every time I would turn around, of course, there was nobody ever there. I started to run. I was freaking the heck out, my thoughts running wild. But no matter how fast I ran, the breathing that was stalking me never stopped. It was always constant, right there in my ear. I could feel something getting closer and closer, and I knew I was in some sort of real danger. I burst through the front doors of the hospital, my friends close behind me as we ran into our car. I could hear the chanting growing louder and louder. I don't know what we stumbled on in the hospital, but I never want to return there again. and anybody who's in rural Alabama and they stumble upon an abandoned mental asylum, definitely don't explore it. The St. John's River Monster Chased Me by Donnie B. I was absolutely ecstatic to kayak down the St. John's River in Florida. I had heard that it was one of the state's most beautiful and peaceful kayaking destinations. As I pushed off from the shore and paddled out into the river, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace and tranquility. The sun was shining, the water was calm. I paddled along, enjoying the beautiful scenery and the occasional splash of water from my paddle. But as I went further down the river, things started to feel off. The water began to get choppier, and I could feel something pulling at my kayak from below. At first, I thought it was just the current, but then I felt something brush up against my leg, and it sent shivers down my spine. I looked down in the murky water, trying to see what was beneath me, but I couldn't see anything. The feeling of being watched grew more robust, and I felt like something was circling my kayak. Suddenly, something slammed into the bottom of the kayak, sending me flying into the water. I thrashed around trying to get back into my kayak, but something grabbed me by the leg and pulled me underwater. I tried to struggle to get free, but the thing was holding on to me very strongly. It almost felt like tentacles, cold and slimy, wrapping around my body. I grasped for air, but all I could taste was salt water. I finally managed to break free and swim to the surface. Gasping for air as I did so, I clambered back into my kayak, shaking and terrified. I didn't know what had just attacked me, but I knew I needed to get out of the water immediately. As I returned to the shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. Every time I looked back, I could see ripples in the water like something was just below the surface. When I finally reached the shore, I stumbled out of my kayak and collapsed onto the sand. I was shaking and covered in water. I couldn't believe what had just happened. As I caught my breath, I looked out into the river, trying to see if I could spot the creature that had attacked me, but there was seemingly nothing there. The river was calm and peaceful, like nothing had ever happened. It felt like I was going crazy, like maybe I had just imagined the entire thing. But as I returned to my car, I noticed something strange. The trees around me were all dead. Their leaves were brown and withered. It was like they had been sucked dry of life, and there was a strange smell in the air, like rotting fish and seaweed. I tried to shake off the dread creeping up, but I couldn't. I knew that something was just wrong, that something was lurking in the water. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel something cold and slimy wrapping around my legs, pulling me under the water. I kept thinking about the dead trees and that strange smell, wondering if they were connected to the creature that had attacked me. The next day, I decided to try to get some research in. I searched the internet up and down for information about strange creatures in the St. John's River, and that's when I found it. There were rumors of an animal that lived in the depth of the river, a beast that had been there for centuries. Some called it the river devil, while others called it the water hag. It was said to be a shapeless being, slimy, with tentacles that it used to drag its prey under the water. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It sounded like something straight out of a horror movie. But the more I read, the more convinced I became that the creature was real. And then I found something out even more disturbing. There have been reports of missing kayakers in the area, and I think I know why. I grew up in a very safe area for most of my young life. It was one of those neighborhoods where all the kids knew each other and often stayed out well after dark in the summers to play flashlight tag or search. Our biggest concern was calling our parents to let them know we would be sleeping over at our friend's house. I mention all of this to understand how terrifying my mother's story was to a relatively sheltered 16-year-old me. My mother was and remained one of the most muscular women I have ever known. She survived decades of mental, emotional, and I suspect in her early years physical abuse from my sociopathic father. When he tried to prevent her from getting away by refusing to help cover college expenses, she moved out and paid every cent independently. When a drunk redneck attempted to assault a friend of hers in a way that's not so good for YouTube, she gave him a hard right hook and dropped that pile of human garbage. And if people ever threatened her kid's safety, God help them. That woman would make Mama Grizzlies look friendly. So, as you might imagine, I never thought anything could scare this woman. But now I understand that even the bravest person can fear for their survival when monsters come out of the shadows. This takes place around 1985 in my home state of South Carolina. My parents had only been married for about 2 years, both very excited and determined to make something of themselves. They didn't have much money back then and rented a tiny apartment until they could save enough to buy a house. My mom hated that apartment, precisely the large window in their bedroom that people from the street could easily see into. They wanted to put up curtains, but there were no rods, and the landlord was a cheapskate who threatened to keep their deposit if they even put a dent in the wall. It annoyed them that they couldn't even have privacy in their own home, but they decided to ignore it since it was a short-term lease. This would be a very big mistake. Never ignore your gut. This open window would cause Mom to have nightmares for years after. And now, let me tell you about how a murderer first targeted my mom as a potential victim. My mom was an avid runner and a competitive cross-country athlete through high school and college. So, she often went for 3 or 4 mile-long runs in the evenings to clear her mind after work. She was running in a rural area, with few houses and a little traffic on the road. It was an area that high schools like to use in the fall for track and cross-country training. She was out in early summer, so there were no students or other runners around. She liked the quiet and kind of mentally drifted off for a bit. As an old brown-colored car with tinted windows came up behind her, she moved off the road to let them pass. The car seemed to be going past her. The windows were even with her, and then it slowed down. The vehicle stayed this way for about 10 minutes or so, never speeding or slowing, only staying a few feet behind her. My mom realized this person had bad intentions and knew her life was potentially in danger. Worse, there was no one around who could help. She had to make a quick decision, so she sprinted off into the field next to her, thankfully finding a small ditch lined with several thick bushes. She crawled into the largest one and laid flat on her stomach to hide. The car had tried to follow, but the curb had hindered the back wheels. The person attempting to gun it, but the car would not go forward. They were able to reverse it and get back on the road. They drove up the road several times, most likely trying to see if they could spot my mom. After 5 or 6 passes, they gave up and drove off. Mom was so scared she barely remembered to breathe, shaking and crying, waiting for this malicious person to get out of the car. Thankfully, they never did. After waiting 30 minutes and no sign of the car, she returned to her apartment as quickly as she could. My dad was home at the time and shocked to see her state. She told him what had happened and wondered if they should call the cops. My dad promised her he would take care of it and told her to take a long warm shower so she could relax. After all, this was home and he would never let anyone hurt her. Mom took that shower and started feeling better when she looked out their bedroom window. I think you can guess what she saw parked just outside. It was the same car. Utterly terrified, she screamed and my dad came running. She pointed at the car and he lost it. He bolted out of the apartment and ran towards the car, shouting that he would kill them if they even thought about touching his wife. Just to let you know, my dad was about 5'10" and thin as a rail, friendly and always ready to give a helping hand. He was not an intimidating figure to most people, but that day, my dad showed that animal side of him. He showed this creep that he would do whatever it took to protect his family. The car immediately backed up, tires squealing as the man booked it. My parents later called the cops and told them everything. Unfortunately, there wasn't much they could really do but ask questions, basically, since there was no actual physical attack. All they could do was make a note and advise my mom not to run for quite some time. The way they said it made it seem as if she was the problem. They grudgingly accepted this and moved to a new place shortly after. No deposit was worth their lives. A few months passed and reports of multiple young women going missing followed by 2 murders brought closure to this story. My mom recognized the car the murderer was driving. It was the same one that had stalked her. What made her blood run cold was the picture of his victims. All young, blonde, blue-eyed women who could have been her sisters. Over the years I've googled the victims and it's shocking how they looked just like her, down to how they styled their hair.
According to the FBI profiler who went on to write the book that inspired Mindhunter, this man was one of the most vicious and sadistic killers he had ever dealt with. Maybe the most evil one in his career. After reading about how he would torture the families and make those poor girls write a last will before murdering them, I'm inclined to agree. For anyone wondering, you can learn more about this sick guy and his crimes by googling Larry Gene Bell. I want to say the year was 2005 or 2006. I was 7 or 8 years old and at a family cookout in a haunted ghost town called Pinckneyville, South Carolina. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why the hell am I at a cookout in a ghost town? Well, a family friend owns the land that surrounds it, and still does to this day. I'm not sure what the event was for, but we were always barbecuing and riding ATVs through rural upstate South Carolina trails back then. It was just what we did. Now, I had always heard stories about this place from my mother and father, but I always brushed them off as BS or campfire tales. There are also rumors of the area being inhabited by devil worshippers, but I'm not so sure that's true. I didn't believe this place was haunted until my cousin and I rode our ATVs down one of the many trails. Just me and him, no one else. We were both young. I'm 7 or 8 and he's 8 or 9. It is broad daylight, and as we're riding, we both must take a quick bathroom break, so we stop, get off our rides, and start using the bathroom. I can't speak for my cousin, but I felt weird, like something just didn't feel right. Everything seemed dead. There was no wind, no birds chirping, nothing at all. So after we relieved ourselves, we turned around and noticed a dilapidated building. Wondering why we didn't see it before, we stopped. I don't know. I really don't know how to explain the feeling I had upon looking on this thing. Regardless, we were curious, but we knew enough history of the area to not go about in an old building. So we just looked around and quickly noticed old tombstones that could easily be mistaken for big rocks as they were ancient and weathered. We had just taken a pee in an old haunted graveyard by accident. We looked at each other almost at the exact same time and said, "Oh crap." We quickly jumped onto the ATVs and desperately tried to start the engines, but to no avail. I turned to the key and pushed the start button and nothing, as almost if the battery was dead. My cousin's ATV was also dead. For about a minute or two, we're just trying to get our ATVs to start. And luckily, just when we thought we were screwed, at the same time our engines fired up and we proceeded to get out of there as fast as possible. I can't explain it. That sense of impending doom, like something was preying upon you, but we couldn't see or hear anything at all, was just absolutely menacing. When we returned to where the rest of our family was, we didn't mention it to anyone. I was happy to be with my dad and have a sense of safety. We didn't ride our ATVs for the rest of the day, and I haven't been to Pinckneyville ever since. I was driving around my old friend's neighborhood, keeping an eye on the place, as it was quite the hot spot for unnatural occurrences. One such instance, when he and I were walking down his street, the sun was setting, and the evening breeze glided through the trees. All the while, a peaceful, heavy, and suffocating surrealist filled the atmosphere. Just as a shiver went up my spine, he turned to the edge of the woods, and I followed suit soon after. As if on cue, a man's yell, painful and full of agony, broke the eerie serenity of the evening. Now we are both on edge and hasten our pace and walk hurriedly. His home was just 10 minutes from where we were, but we knew that anything could happen between here and there if we weren't careful. About 5 minutes away from his house, another yell boomed from the woods. Only this time it was altered from before, becoming more and more animalistic as it dragged on. We increased our pace again, nearly running at this point. The daylight almost completely gone, and after an hour, we finally reached his front porch. That's when we heard it. Behind us we heard a screech in the woodline, an awful combination of a rooster's crow, a goat's bleat, and a dog's bark. After that, whatever it was, hissed and began coming towards us at a very quick pace. The leaves in the trees rustled as it got nearer and nearer, jumping down from the branches and into the brush of the bushes and smaller foliage. We heard it land on the ground, and soon after, it came crashing towards us, stopping just before it broke out of the wood's cover. Whatever it was, began breathing heavily and pointed its bony, clawed finger out at us, curling it in a motion as if it was tempting us to come towards it. Not long after, my friend unlocked his door and swung it open, both of us stumbling inside and slamming its door shut behind us. As we did, whatever that thing was hit against it and tried to break it down, if not at the very least frighten us. It then sounded like it jumped from the porch and back into a tree, dashing back into the woods. Later that night, we heard occasional scratching and tapping noises on the windows and doors and other parts of the house, but we didn't bother to open the blinds or investigate. Thankfully, we had the pleasure of not seeing what the rest of it looked like, but we did have the misfortune of hearing its screams. That's just one of the many uncomfortable, yet equally exciting experiences we've had together. If you want to investigate the area, visit Holbrook, South Carolina. It's in Dorchester County, a quaint and quiet little neighborhood. Unfortunately, most of it has been deforested for housing development, but that doesn't precisely restrain any odd things from occurring. Just be on guard and stay safe. These occurrences take place in my new home in South Carolina. For some backstory, it was the year 2006 when I moved into my current home. I used to be an avid outdoorsman. I used to, anyway. Yesterday, while out on one of my daily hikes during the evening, I found an old, rotting note. After reading this note, I highly doubt I'll be back to those woods for a long while. The note read, "I was out with a few friends for a get-together for a friend of mine. He was going to leave for college in a week, so everyone wanted him to go out with a bang. We were having this get-together in some private property that one of my friends, my few friends were Brandon, Kyle, Alfred, and myself, we used this property to drive around the ATVs and dirt bikes we owned. We drank for a while quite carelessly. Eventually, one of us had the idiotic idea to ride our ATVs around to make the effects of being heavily intoxicated even more extreme. I sluggishly went along. Someone had to be able to watch and make sure nothing happened to them. But it had to be me. I had drunk the second least to Brandon. I was basically completely sober. As we drove further, a sound that I could not describe to this day began to become more prevalent as we went further into the woods. The sound became so overpowering at one point that it covered up the loud noise of our bikes. Eventually, we were all on the ground screaming and covering our ears in pain and torment. No matter which direction we ran, even out of the woods, the sound would still grow louder. At this point, the sound became clear to me that it was most likely a scream. Then I saw something that I will never forget. I saw these, what I can only describe as animals. They looked like pale, light gray humanoid-type creatures. They had to have stood at least 4 feet at the shoulder. Their heads had borne the charges of dogs, but the teeth were tiny, blood-red knives. The screaming noise had ceased to stop. Then, there was one creature that stood out from the other 8. This one stood about 6 feet tall at the shoulder. He had a much more muscular build than the others, who looked malnourished. His mouth was wide open, still bearing those sharp, long needle-like teeth. But the biggest one, which I supposed was the leader, made a different noise. I could only describe this noise as a clicking noise. It may be necessary to mention that I have the most powerful build of all 4 of us. After my friend had been dragged away so inhumanly fast, I couldn't run that fast if my life depended on it, but at this point it did. But while my friends and I were being dragged away, I realized something. The screaming had stopped. After about 2 or 3 miles, there was a pit of bones from different animals, but the most common were human bones. The stench was so nerve-wracking that I eventually passed out. When I woke up, my friends were already dead. After seeing the bodies of my friends being eaten by the creatures, I will never be the same. The screaming stopped when the animals had something in their mouths. The screaming almost drove me insane. I resorted to feeding the creatures. All my family, friends, and pets, all the people I know are gone. My family, friends, and even my pets are gone. I think the police are beginning to understand what is going on now. They have been showing up at my house more and more lately. The screaming won't stop. I have nothing to feed them except for myself. This is my suicide letter before I jump into the place where I keep the creatures away from all society. Anyone who finds this note, please drop the note now and run. I don't want anyone else to suffer my fate. Now, for whatever reason, I believe that this note is truly genuine more and more by day. A strange screaming noise has been coming closer to my home every night that I keep hearing. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to live here. Every night they just get a little bit closer, and a little bit closer. With my trusty revolver at my side tonight, I will most likely not be able to sleep. The sounds that I hear at night freak me out so bad that I can't sleep, and I have to somehow find some sort of prescription drug to make it work. I could hear a scratching noise at my door recently. I'm hoping that things are gonna improve before I get out of here, or hopefully at least hold off until I move. I plan to move back in with my parents in a few days' time. Wish me luck, because I sure as hell am gonna need it. Like I said, when I first found that note, I thought it was just some sort of short scary story, maybe something that somebody had put there to scare people. But after I'm starting to experience these things myself, this story is starting to seem a little bit more real. I wish I had more information on this story. It was a very brief encounter that has always stayed with me since I was young. It may not be the most eventful, but it creeped me out. It started when I was young. When I was about 6 or 7 years old, my family lived in an old house with a few dogs in South Carolina. It was far from uneventful there. I heard strange noises and saw strange lights outside our house. I was convinced the place was haunted. As it turns out, I may not have been wrong. One of the weirdest things that ever happened to me happened outside of that house. I used to go outside a lot back then. I loved being outside, and the feeling of being out there, regardless of how warm or cold it was freeing to me. But I usually came back in before it got too dark out. I didn't stay out in the middle of the night, but one day I decided to stay out just for a bit longer into the evening. It was getting around 6:30 when I finally decided to go back inside that day. But before I did, I was interrupted by something extraordinary. Above my house was this sort of hill past a road that went through a forest. Up there was a neighborhood, plenty of people living there, at least for some nowhere southern town. Up there was a strange figure. I'd say it was tall, maybe 6 feet tall, but it was hard to tell from where I was standing, and the memories had been understandably vague since I was very young. I just sat there, staggered in disbelief. A tall, pitch-black humanoid figure loomed over me just over the hill. It was blank, and just black, sort of like a shadow. It looked distorted though, like the shadow was moving around like static TV, if that makes any sense. Me being young and confused, I was stunned. It was so bizarre. I didn't know what to do, but the door was right behind me so I could run back into my parents at any moment. I felt safe for that reason. I waved at the creatures as it stood there, and it gave me some sort of wave back for a few seconds. I was so creeped out that chills went down my spine. My heart was pounding, and goosebumps rose on my arms. It looked human and was now acting human. It started making other motions, and the thing, honestly, kind of had a mind of its own, but also was copying my every movement. I started making other motions, and the thing just copied them every time. I even walked closer and poked behind a tree, and it pretended to do the same, even though there was no tree for it to hide behind. I was thoroughly amused. I realized I would probably seem like a madman making weird motions to anybody who saw me. I looked around to see if anybody was looking. When I looked back at the creature, it was no longer there. The way it just stood there at first and then copied my every motion later was so strange and downright creepy the more I think about it. It seems like it was straight out of a horror story or something. The start of some climactic series of events. But I never saw anything like it again. I'm sure there has to be some sort of plausible explanation somewhere out there. But until then, this is the only paranormal story that I have.
White creatures in the woods. by Memphis bassist. I have seen hundreds of these things at night in the woods in the rural areas of Memphis starting around 2020. They are tall humanoid creatures with blacked out eyes and move slowly and in strange, jerky movements. The first time I saw them was visiting a veteran friend who was down on his luck at about midnight on Thanksgiving Day in 2020. He lived on his brother's property in a rundown camper vehicle at the edge of the woods. Between his camper and the tree line, there was the remains of an old trailer that had been destroyed by a tornado some years back. It still had a streetlight on top of the pole that used to run electricity to the destroyed home, and on the other side of the bar was approximately 15 yards or meters of a field that then eventually turns into a dirt road and splits in half with tall grass and brush on the edge of the far side and the other area being nothing but trees. When I first started seeing these creatures, I thought they were people hiding at first, as they seemed to be grouping more in the darker areas where the light of the pole was not as bright. So I asked my friend about them. Maybe he had some squatters or something that were just drugged out, and he shrugged it off and said that this is actually not a squatter. This was something he had been dealing with for a long time. They were always there, and it didn't really bother him because they didn't do anything really. He also told me that no matter what you did, you could never really get close to one. So, being a combat veteran with 2 deployments under my belt and a firearm for my vehicle, I did just that. I attempted to approach these things. As I got closer, I noticed they were solid white creatures with these weird black eye sockets that moved in a jerky but prolonged manner. There had to be at least 50 or more of them in that field, down the dirt road and at the edge of the tree line and beyond. Determined to let something mess around and find out, I continued to walk towards them, and all of a sudden, they all looked at me with black, empty-looking sockets and instantly caused me to feel more fear than I ever have. I did not approach them that night. I simply turned away, left that area, and took my buddy with me to stay for a few nights at my place because I did not want to leave him there alone. Since the first time I saw them, I have seen them about a dozen times, always at night and around wooded areas at all different locations. I have since tried to run and catch them and failed many times because these things disappear the moment I close in within 5 to 10 yards. Anytime I lose direct eye contact, even if it's just a mere second, they're gone in a mere flash. They can phase in or out or something like that. It almost seems like they're interdimensional. If you can get in close, you can see that the weird jerky movements are a part of their arms, legs, and heads disappearing and reappearing in different positions. They disappear anytime they move, so they have not been seen walking. I have tried to shoot these things many times from my AR-15, but it just seems like no evidence is ever left behind. These things do make audible noises that can be recorded, but does not appear on video from a cell phone or old analog camcorder with cassette tapes. Animals also seem to see them. However, I have tried to show them to people, only about half of those I have shown have actually seen them. I have wondered if I'm losing my mind or if anyone else has ever seen these creatures and tried other experiments. I have searched all over the internet and found a few cryptids that share 1 or 2 similar things, but nothing close enough for me to be satisfied. The only comparable thing was the origin of white zombies, sort of. A few people have told me about this shape-shifting creature, but they don't change or bleed. They are different sizes, some are larger, some are smaller, and usually they are in groups. I like to call them family clusters, and typically there's 4 to 5 of them, usually with 2 taller ones and 1 or 2 smaller ones. Please let me know if you have any ideas of what these could be, or if you have ever heard of something like this before. My Encounter with Something Horrible by J. Mad. Your podcast is how I get through my workday, so thank you for what you do first and foremost. So, to tell my story, a few little backstories need to be told leading up to it. My parents were nurses that worked a lot, so I spent most of my time with my grandparents who lived in a missionary community in Georgia. This meant that I had a strict Christian upbringing. When I was 7 years old, I had a horrible nightmare. This would be the first time that I would see whatever this thing was. In my dream, my dad was at work in the emergency room. It's hard to explain what it was like as a person,
but at the same time, it had no distinguishable features. I saw it walk across the ER waiting room and put its hand on my dad's shoulder. My dad collapsed right then and there, having a heart attack, and died. I woke up screaming, absolutely covered in sweat. I wouldn't stop until my mother called my dad at work and got him on the phone. My dad told me that he was just fine and to not worry. However, my dad took my warning very seriously and asked one of the doctors at the hospital that night if they wouldn't mind just looking at him. Unfortunately, my dad did have a heart attack right there with that doctor. I still can't explain how or why, but if my dad had not had his heart attack and looked around at that moment, he would not have made it. When my dad came home from the hospital a few days later, he sat me down to talk. They told me not to tell anybody else about my dream or what had happened. He said they wouldn't understand, especially my grandparents and the people at the mission. He said they would fear me and think I was some sort of witch or evil. So I kept my promise. A few other times as a kid, I just seemed to know things, little things like car wrecks or things that would break down very small. I was also cautious around my grandparents after my dad's warnings. Although I grew up Christian, I believe that science can explain everything. Science hasn't caught up yet, so anything outside the known science is supernatural. I've had a lot of what you could call paranormal encounters over the years, and maybe I will get to some of those stories at a later date. But for now, let's go to August 2018. My dad, the previous year, had a surgery to remove a cancerous mass. He had 10 good months. Then one day he called me and my sister and I, and he was at the hospital. I had to come immediately. My dad had been admitted, and the prognosis was not looking good. The cancer was back, and there was nothing they could do. My dad was sitting in the chair in his hospital room, and I was sitting in his bed talking to him. Standing behind him was this human-like shadow creature I had seen in my dreams years ago. Even though it didn't have a face, I could tell it was looking at me standing behind my dad's chair. It had one hand on each of my dad's shoulders. I didn't tell my dad what I saw. I knew he would die, and I could do nothing about it. Call it death, call it an angel, whatever you like. The entire time we talked, this thing just stood there. Finally, my dad started telling me he was so tired, and he just couldn't do this anymore. I told him it was okay. I will miss you, but it's okay, you can go. I looked up at the creature, and I said it's okay, he can go. The best I can describe is this thing nodded at me, and the whole room gave me a feeling of understanding and acceptance. I helped my dad get into bed, he closed his eyes, and that would be the last time we would ever speak. His body held on for a few more hours. After that, they would let us take him home so he could die. My family and I rushed home while my mother stayed at the hospital to prepare everything for my dad to come home. The hospital bed had just been delivered and everything was set up. My dad was loaded into the ambulance with my mother. It's a 20-minute ride from the hospital to my parents' house. 15 minutes after my mom said they had left the hospital, I was waiting next to the front door. When I looked up and saw the thing again, it looked at me. It looked at me and I completely lost it. I started crying uncontrollably and then the phone rang. Finally, I got my tears under control enough to answer. I said hello. It was my mom. She told me your dad just took his last breath. I looked at the creature again. It put its hand on my shoulder to comfort me and seemingly disappeared. It would be 3 years before I would see the thing again. My mother fought COVID for 14 days at home. Finally, on day 14, she called me to say she could barely breathe. Please take me to the hospital. She wanted me to come so that someone could sit with my disabled little brother. My mother held on, but they put her on a ventilator on day 7. My mom did not want to be on a ventilator, so for 14 days I fought the hospital. They finally agreed to take her out of the ventilator. My older brother was finally coming up from Florida to be with me, and the hospital agreed to remove the ventilator the next day at around 11. My brother got to my house at around dinner time. After dinner, we were all so exhausted we went to bed at 2 a.m. I got the call that our mother's vitals were dropping. It would be best if you came now. With COVID, you weren't allowed in the hospital, and I'm still so grateful they let me in with my brother. I arrived at the hospital, and at first, security would not let me up, but the ICU doctor informed them that I was coming anyway. Once we got into the ICU, of course, all the COVID patients in their classrooms were isolated from the world, but what I saw there shook me to the core. This creature, that thing that I have seen take my dad away, was once again there, ready to take my mother. But this time, I swear it was accompanied by others, and they were better to find. The others looked more like shadows. They were standing in front of certain glass rooms. I was terrified that they would kick me out of it if I said anything, so I didn't react. I just looked at them, and it looked at me. They gave me a chair to sit in front of my mother's room, and through glass I watched her vitals slowly break down. My brother came up, and they put a chair next to mine. The thing stood there behind us with one hand on our shoulders. It's something that you almost can't feel. It's like a slight chill on your shoulder. It almost feels like there's a little breeze, but it's not noticeable enough to really freak out like if somebody's actually grabbing you. Eventually, the doctor came to us, let us know that she was gone, and the shadow was gone. I believe there's a scientific explanation for everything, and maybe we just don't understand it yet. But I definitely saw some sort of creature, unknown cryptid, or just some sort of spirit. I couldn't tell you. I don't know if the thing is dead, an angel, a ghost, a guardian, or if I have that type of intuition that just lets me see dark energy. Sometimes, though, I like to listen to your stories on this podcast because it makes me feel less alone. Perhaps some other time I can tell you about the attempted exorcism they tried to perform on me once. UK Cryptid Encounter by Marco B. I am a South African man living in Motherwell, Scotland, UK. I am 42 years old and have lived in the UK for 18 years. I moved here in September 2004. Now, I never really believed in cryptids. This is because I was raised as an average, science-believing individual. I was always told to think that you only believe in a creature's existence when it has been cataloged and its DNA is on record. In 2004, I moved to the UK, and at the time, I was living in a town north of Liverpool called Southport. It is in the Merseyside, in the northwestern part of England. It is the typical sleepy English seaside town. Several weeks after I had moved there around Christmas time, a bunch of my friends and I decided to visit a forest area in the countryside nearby a town called Formby, which is just north of Liverpool. Now, the Christmas time of year is freezing gray and bleak, so when we arrived at the forest, got out of our cars, and walked about, it looked very eerie, like something out of those old Dracula movies or a Bram Stoker story. Not long after arriving, we began to hear these weird howling noises, and it really did give me the creeps. My friends told me not to worry about it. It was probably just the wind or something, but that did not make me feel any better, and something really just did not feel right to me. So I looked at the treetops, and they were not swaying about at all. I pointed this out to them, but they told me not to worry. Things are just fine, according to them, but I just felt like something was terribly wrong. Anyway, this weird howling sound continued, and then the sound started to become like primal grunts. Deep and guttural, like that of a great African ape. I could not believe it. I was in frigid England, in the middle of a forest, hearing these ape-like grunts. I started getting twitchy. I was starting to get anxiety and freaking out. I had not seen anything, but I was sure this was something feral and not something natural. So in this bunch of friends, there was a fellow South African. I told him, "Herman, does this not sound like apes or monkeys to you? You know, like the ones back home in Africa." He listened for a while. Then he said, "Yes, you're right. That is exactly like the monkeys and apes in Africa would sound like." With an absolute look of bewilderment on his face, our friends laughed and said the monkeys had followed us from Africa. And as they were laughing, there was this loud howling, bellowing scream which seemed to fill the heavens, the forest, the ground, the trees, and our very bodies. Finally, they stopped their laughter and we got out of there as quickly as possible. We drove out of that forest at top speed and spent the rest of the day at the dunes nearby Formby. There, we knew we would be safer because there were more people around and more civilization. It has been many years since this has happened, and I moved about until I settled in Motherwell, Scotland. And even though I have never seen anything physical, and that day all I did was hear things, it must have been something very big. It made such a terrible sound that I don't even know how to describe it. It is a sound I have never heard before, and I've never heard it since. But if I did listen to it again, I would instantly recognize it. Since then, I've become more open to believing cryptids and animals and other things that we don't know about. I have not told many people my story since it happened, but when I do, I get the old nod and roll of the eyes like, say, okay, crazy, and then everybody just kind of moves on with their own camp stories. I just don't know how to explain it, but I do hope you share this story. Something Lurks on These Highways by Anonymous. I've been an over-the-road truck driver for over a decade now, and I've seen some strange things on the highways and byways of this great country. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I saw this one night. It was a dark and stormy night, as cliché as that sounds, and I was driving down an isolated stretch of highway. The rain was coming down in sheets, making it hard to see more than just a few feet in front of me. The only light came from the headlights of my truck, and even they were barely cutting through the thick darkness. As I rounded a curve, something caught my eye. A figure stood just ahead of me in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes, trying to avoid hitting whatever it was. As my truck came to a screeching stop, I peered out into the rain, trying to get a better look at whatever this thing is. That's when I saw it. Now, it wasn't a person, or even an animal. It was something else entirely. It was tall and skinny with long arms and legs. These legs, they seemed to stretch forever. It was sickly pale. Its eyes were bright red in the darkness. I froze, unable to move or even speak. I couldn't conjure any words. I could not believe what I was seeing in front of me. Was this some sort of monster? A demon? Or was I just hallucinating from being on the road for too long? The creature started to move towards me and I panicked. I slammed on the gas trying to escape it quickly, but it was way too fast, way too agile. It easily kept up with the truck, matching my speed stride for stride. For an eternity I drove down that dark and lonely road with that thing chasing me close behind. I could hear its low growls over the engine and roar, and I swear I could almost feel the sensation of it breathing on my neck. Finally, I saw signs for a rest stop up ahead. I took a chance, swerved off the road, hoping to lose the creature in confusion. As I pulled into the rest stop, I looked back, expecting to see it, following me, but it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I sat in my truck for quite a long time, trying to calm down and make sense of what the hell had just happened. Was it real, or was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? I may never know for sure, but one thing is certain: I'll never forget that night or the terror that came with it. A Wendigo Nearly Ended Us by Canadian Bacon 443. I remember the day vividly. My friends and I decided to take a mountain biking trip through the rugged terrain of British Columbia. It was supposed to be an adventure of a lifetime, but little did we know that it would become a nightmare. We had been riding for quite some time, at least 3 or 4 hours, and the sun was setting behind the mountains. We were in the middle of nowhere, and the darkness was creeping up on us fast. We decided to take a break and set up camp for the night. As we settled down, we heard a strange noise in the distance. At first, it sounded like a low rumbling sound, but as we listened and it got closer, it became more apparent that it was a low growl, almost like some sort of animal. We tried our best to ignore it and chalked it up to the wilderness, but it grew louder and more persistent by the minute. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the woods. It was tall and thin with elongated limbs and sunken eyes. It nearly looked like a person, but it just wasn't. Its skin was sickly pale. Its limbs were like unnaturally long. We froze right then and there, unable to move as it approached us slowly. We could smell its rotting breath. The stench made us gag. Finally, its eyes locked onto us, letting out an ear-piercing screech. We knew we had to run. We grabbed our bikes and pedaled as fast as we could, leaving everything at our campsite behind, hoping that it would be more interested in that than us. We did have some food cooking at the time. But the creature did not give a single crap about any of that. It was right behind us, its claws scraping against the ground as it chased us. We didn't dare look back, but we could hear it gaining on us at every second. Our hearts were pounding in our chest, and as we tried to pedal faster, it was like we were in a nightmare and couldn't wake up. Finally, we made it to a small cabin in the woods. We barricaded ourselves inside, hoping it would keep the creature out. But we could hear it scratching at the door, trying to find a way in. We spent the night huddled together, too scared to move, trying to keep anything we could in front of that door to block it. Every noise made us jump, and every shadow seemed to move. We were sure we were going to die that night. Luckily, as the sun finally began to show, we emerged from the cabin the following day and the creature disappeared. We never spoke of that night again, but it stayed with us forever. We knew that we had encountered something beyond our understanding that was not of this world, and we knew that we were lucky to have made it out alive. As we pedaled our way down to the parking lot, we knew that we would never come back to this area, that's for sure, but we also knew what we saw. This was a wendigo, without a doubt. A lot of us had heard stories growing up, but we never thought they were real. To get this story started, here is a bit of background information about myself. I am a female, 17 years of age. I'm very petite, weighing about 100 pounds and standing at just 5'3". I recently joined my local gym around January 2019 and have started a routine of when I work out every day, except for Monday, sometime around 6 p.m. usually, and usually I'll stay for about an hour or two depending on the day and how I feel. Anyone who goes to the gym regularly notices others around them and gets familiar with what times and machines are usually available. And if a new person comes, you usually notice them. My point is that you get used to these people in the gym with you, whether or not you communicate with them. As a girl who goes to the gym, from my experience, you will get the occasional glance from a weirdo or make awkward eye contact with someone staring at you in the mirror. But all you can do is stare back at them dead in the eyes and give them the nastiest look of disgust. Now, the time that I go to the gym is when everyone usually starts to leave. I am very antisocial and shy, so this works out great for me. Or so I had thought having some alone time would be excellent. And if something were to happen, they would have cameras everywhere. Now I know this is a stupid way to think, but knowing that you had to have a key card to get into the gym and one to get out was a comfort along with the cameras. For this past month of me doing my workouts, I got this weird vibe from this random guy we will call Randy. As I said, you usually get people looking at you, so it is hard to tell if someone is genuinely a significant threat or just someone being a creep. Either way, both are usually bad, but it's difficult to distinguish the two. I told my mom about this Randy guy because my gut feeling told me something was just wrong and I felt like I needed some advice. She told me we should tell the manager and have them kick him out. But being naive and friendly, I didn't want to kick a guy out just for giving me the creeps. It wasn't a good argument at the time. I started to notice some of the other girls weren't coming as regularly as they would. I brushed this off thinking they had work or were out of town or something. It was really none of my business, but it was something to note. The staff of the gym leaves around 6:30 p.m., and I noticed that Randy was coming in almost precisely when the manager and staff would leave. Again, I didn't really pay too much attention to this because he could have just been a regular person trying to work out at a specific time due to his job or whatever was going on in his life. This was a huge mistake on my end. Here is me trying to reason with myself and rationalize that nothing was going on because I constantly saw Randy. So I considered him one of the regulars, I guess. But this is where the story actually begins. I went to do my daily workout and the manager, let's call her Alyssa, came up and talked to me about other girls who worked out at the same time I did. These girls were complaining about Randy, secretly recording them while they worked out. The girls changed their workout schedule due to Randy, which explains why I saw fewer and fewer of them. She asked me if I had seen any men holding their phone up to their chest and walking with the camera pointed outwards. I said no, until I told Alyssa about this random man Randy, who was starting to creep me out. She said she would look into it and update me on the situation, mainly since I'm underage. The next day, Alyssa talked to me. She said that one of the girls who complained about him pointed him out on the cameras and that she would wait for Randy to come back into the gym, kick him out, and trespass him if he ever came back. She left that night not knowing what had happened because Alyssa was still waiting after I left. I returned to the gym that following Tuesday and Alyssa told me everything that had gone down. She had said that she waited till Randy and his buddy, who we will call Kyle, came to the gym and were parked outside. Alyssa had a friend who was a sheriff. Apparently, he rang up Randy's license plates, and to both of their surprises, he was a registered sex offender and had put on probation recently. Alyssa then found out that Randy didn't even have a key card, meaning he was not a member of the gym and shouldn't have been using the gym, period. His friend Kyle had a key card and was letting Randy in. They would work out sometimes and wait for the staff to leave and do creepy things. Alyssa prohibited both of the men entering the gym again and kicked them out. The scary thing is that I remember being alone in that gym with those two guys very often. They blended in very well, and I consider them just average workout people. I'm still not sure if Randy or Kyle recorded me, but Alyssa told me she was going to look through the footage and let me know any other news she could, such as them recording me and all that. It is terrifying to think that I got accustomed to these guys regularly being at the gym. I am so thankful that Alyssa kept me informed on the situation. As terrifying as it is, it shows that you should always be aware of what's happening around you and to trust your instincts. It also shows that you never can trust anyone you think you might know. As stupid as it sounds, it's easy to get comfortable with people we see daily even if we don't know who they are. But who knows what might have happened if I caught Randy and Kyle alone again. Please be careful at all times. Never judge anyone for good or bad until you actually know them. You never know what might be out there to hurt you. Thank you for your time in reading the story.
Every Barbie Has Her Ken by J. Beardify. At my college, Halloween is the social event of the year. As soon as the leaves start to change, the campus comes alive. Art students gather in the quad to design and assemble homemade costumes. Sororities hold pumpkin carving competitions and fraternities compete to throw the wildest, freakiest parties imaginable. 2 years ago, Kappa Alpha hired costume actors to hide inside the closets and hide behind the shower curtains of the party to give people jump scares. But they lost the informal competition to one of the other medical fraternities who'd stolen a real John Doe corpse from the autopsy lab and put it in their bathtub full of ice and drinks. They got in a lot of trouble for that one. Everyone was always trying to outdo each other. I guess it's no surprise that Halloween here has a dark side as well. Those jump scare actors hiding in the Kappa Alpha house, they weren't all actors. One was a guy that just came off the street, slipped on a costume, and tried to drag a girl from the party into the abandoned basement. But some of the guys fought him off. He was never caught. Oh, and the corpse at that medical fraternity party? The morning after, they found someone had bitten pieces off of it. Last year, my buddy Matt was in charge of organizing our frat's Halloween party. He's a buff, blonde, handsome guy with a good sense of humor. So, one of us jokingly suggested his costume should be Ken from the Barbie franchise. And he went with it. Matt even started walking around campus in costume the week before Halloween, trying to drum up interest in our party. I noticed, though, he had started looking worn and haggard. I asked him what was going wrong.
"You wouldn't even believe me if I told you,"
was his tired response. As it turned out, he didn't have to. A few nights later, as we were unloading crates of fake spider webs to decorate the frat house, I saw her for the first time. The woman was dressed in all pink and freakishly exaggerated makeup and big blonde hair. She was coming towards us along the sidewalk and she was moving like a doll. "Matt, there's..." The woman just stopped beneath a streetlight, staring at my friend. But when I finally got him to turn around, the bulb flickered and she was gone. The next day I saw her again, or another woman just like her, walking through the hallway between classes. Her proportions were all wrong. If like a Barbie doll had become human. Her wrists and ankles were way too thin. Her chest and hips too big. I felt sick thinking of how a person could have mutilated their body to get in such a shape like that. But on her face was a perfect plastic smile. As she passed by, she ran her freakishly long pink fingernails through Matt's hair.
"See you at the party, Ken, baby," she whispered. I turned to say something, but she had already turned around and been carried away by the crowd. Matt shuddered. "That is the wrong Barbie. I see her everywhere. The other day, while I was on the toilet, someone came into the bathroom in hot pink heels. She stood right outside of the stall door, whispering, 'Ken, baby, don't you want to come out and play?' By the time I got up, she was gone. One of the sororities must be screwing with me. That's gotta be it, right?" I wasn't so sure. Maybe it was just her tanning bed baked, wrinkly skin, but Matt's Barbie looked too old to still be in college. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised to see her at the fraternity party. Matt's Barbie was bringing him a pair of drinks, one for him and one for her. She floated through the crowd of students like a blonde cloud in hot pink heels, wearing that big fake smile. Now that I was closer to her, I realized she couldn't have made any other expression. It was like her face had been plastic surgery to only make that smile, forever. Just like a doll's, she didn't speak to anyone except Matt, and she called him Ken all night. She whispered to him in a cutesy but also really creepy babying voice that made her face seem even more like a plastic mask. I was worried about my friend. I went through all 3 floors of the house asking if anyone knew the woman in the Barbie outfit, but nobody did. I figured it was time to tell Matt to throw her out, but when I went back downstairs, Barbie was sitting on Matt's lap and he had a boozy, contented smile on his face. Everyone else obviously uncomfortable around this weirdly proportioned stranger, but it was Matt's party. If he wanted to make out with an older woman with a thing for Barbie, who the hell were we to deny him? I didn't see Matt again until I was getting some vodka out of the ice-filled bathtub a few hours later. He came stumbling in, grabbed the sides of the toilet, and puked up an awful-smelling hot pink liquid.
Bitch.
He snarled. "She put something in my drink. She's out of here." He staggered woozily back into the crowd. I breathed a sigh of relief. Barbie was giving me creeps. I'd be glad to see her gone, honestly. But wait, Matt was drugged. Could he really handle her on his own? I pushed my way through the costumed crowd. No Matt. I started to panic and ran out front. Barbie had her hands under Matt's armpits. She was dragging him towards the open back door of some sort of white van. I must have screamed because a bunch of guys came running. When we surrounded her, she pulled a needle of I don't even know how to explain it. It was some sort of substance inside. "Which one of you Ken boys wants to find out what's in the needle, She hissed at us in that weird baby voice. We put our hands up and backed off, but the distraction gave Matt time to tear himself out of the grasp of her freakishly long nails. Still jabbing the needle in our direction, Barbie got into the driver's seat and burnt rubber. I scrambled to read the license plate as the van's taillights disappeared into the chilly Halloween night. We stood there in silence for quite a few minutes, panting, too stunned by what we had just seen to say freaking anything. Matt puked up another puddle of that acidic pink stuff, and we knew we had to get him to the hospital. It was an unspoken rule at our college that we never went to the police about any shenanigans that we got up to on Halloween. But this was different. Matt had been drugged. The license plate number of the white van had found it to be stolen. They traced it to an abandoned, foreclosed house in a rundown suburb on the edge of town, and what they discovered in the basement confirmed our story. Both of the young men found in the abandoned house had been the same age, body type, and hair color as Matt. Their corpses had even been dressed in matching Ken costumes. Our Barbie had apparently been doing amateur plastic surgery on their faces and bodies, trying to make them perfect, trying to make them like her. Of course, there was no anesthesia, and losing so much blood is always fatal. I'm sure that if we wouldn't have stopped the woman in pink, the same thing would have happened to Matt. What scares me the most, however, is that our Barbie is still out there, cruising Halloween parties, looking for her next Ken. Delivery Driver by E.B. Davis. I'm a delivery driver. Sometimes I wake up not remembering where I am. Yeah, it's not the usual sort of delivery job. Take this morning, for instance. Right now, I've just polished off an omelet and I am finishing off my coffee before hitting the road. About an hour ago, I woke up in a room in a Motel 6 across the street. It had been uncomfortably warm, the failing air conditioning still chugging away, and I had woken with a nasty headache, the result of a poor night's sleep.
Other than that, I had no idea where I was. It was the heat that I remembered first, if you consider it a memory and not something that never went away. I had checked in at about 7 the previous evening. It was a hot summer day, western exposure, and the poor air conditioner never even had a chance. But if I would have known that this air conditioning would fail so badly, I would have asked for a different room or gone somewhere else. I'm not very picky, I just like to not be hot. I pulled the double curtain open just a bit to notice my view of Interstate 5 real up close. Oh, that's right, I was in Redding, Northern California. With that keystone in place, the rest of my memory popped back into place rather well. Yesterday, I had woken up in Eugene, Oregon, made stops in Florence, Eureka, Cave Junction, Weed, and finally Redding before stopping for the night. The day before that, I had woken in Vancouver, British Columbia, with stops in Bellingham, Edison, Elma, Aberdeen, and Astoria before making my way south to Eugene. Today I had stops to make in Zamora, Livermore, Castroville, and Grapevine. Not sure yet where I'll stop tomorrow. Haven't checked my list yet, but it doesn't really matter much. I suppose my memory is pretty decent when I've got a reference to start from. Maybe that's part of why I was picked for this job. Like I said, it's not the usual sort. I drive most of the day and stop somewhere, usually somebody's house or apartment. I drop off a package, often I'll pick up a new one from the same customer and then drive on to the next. I've got a list, a few weeks worth, updated regularly. I've only met my employer, or I suppose I should say my fellow employee of our employer once, when I was hired. It was strange. First, they recruited me right out of the blue, a total cold call. Second, I didn't even think having a PhD was a usual criteria for delivery drivers, you know? Since then, I've only communicated by email or phone, and rarely that. I hadn't expected to accept the offer when I showed up at the little commercial office. The pay was unsustainably generous. I drive a company car they've paid for, though they let me pick it out. I suggested a Mercedes S-Class as a joke, but they didn't hesitate. They gave me a card for food and gas expenses, also hotels. Understand that I don't always sleep in cheap, crummy, sleazy hotels. I'll often stop at a swaggy 4-star resort. It's just that sometimes you just want to get off the road and put your feet up. Even the cheap rooms usually offer a basic standard of quality, and when you're on the road all day every day, the bad rooms and the good rooms tend to just blur together. That's why sometimes I just don't remember where I am. Food, hotels, entertainment, really I have a lot of leeway in how I want to go about my day. Even on the weekends and holidays, I can still use the card. The only thing I need to concern myself with are the few simple aspects of the job. I knock on a stranger's door. I give them the package I've been carrying or they give me a new one. The package is of reasonable proportions, never too big or heavy or unwieldy, very nondescript. I place that package in the trunk of my car, always the trunk, drive to the drop-off, and repeat. I'm to drive carefully and responsibly, which I'd always do anyway, and I'm not to drink or take drugs while driving, or, for that matter, drive while tired or texting, which I'd never do anyway. Minor speeding is not really much of an issue. 5 or 10 over the speed limit on a freeway is not a big deal. If there's any kind of delay, that's not my fault. Unexpected road closures, mechanical trouble, major incidents, inclement weather, it's not really a problem. I just need to phone it in and the company will take care of it. Contact the customers and I can continue on when possible. I'm to not draw attention to myself. If I'm pulled over, I'm to act responsibly and respectfully. And if I receive a ticket, the company will pay the fine. Several years in and I've never had a problem. I am absolutely not to give a police officer any probable cause to search the trunk or the package therein. If a police officer does search, I am to, at the immediate earliest opportunity, call the number the company had me memorize and their legal department will take care of the situation. Afterwards, my position will be terminated and I'll be giving a generous severance package.
The contract makes it very clear that the company is totally liable for any contents of the package, and I am simply a courier, ignorant of the package's contents. I am never to investigate the contents of the package. If I attempt to, my position will be immediately terminated without any severance package. The contract makes it clear that this is how I personally remain unliable for any of the contents. What my contract doesn't say, but I can only guess, is that this is the reason for my exorbitant salary. I suppose maybe there are filthy rich people out there who will pay large sums of money to have various private but perfectly legal items delivered discreetly. I honestly don't think that's the case though for many of these. First, most of the rich people I've met are pretty stingy and would ship something highly valuable by UPS, ground service if they could save a few bucks. Second, I'm pretty sure our customers aren't rich. I meet them personally at their doors. The stop in Elma the other day was at a freaking trailer park. So naturally, my speculation, and for legal purposes, I'll repeat, this is only speculation, was that maybe these packages have illegal contents. I used to spend a lot of time thinking and worrying about what sort of illegal content it could be. I don't think it's drugs. They have their own system of mules for that, right? Maybe that's only on TV, I don't know. Of all the things it could be though, the two possibilities that cost me the most consternation were smuggling or fencing in some kind of valuable commodity, like jewels or works of art. The only other thing that's related that kinda had me nervous was smuggling priceless antiquities. I've read articles about how that's a very lucrative trade, how it's a very small and organized community, and very, very rich. I still don't know what the deal is with the customers though, or maybe that's just some sort of front. There was also something kind of exciting about being involved with illicit antiquities trades. Like I was a minor bad guy out of an Indiana Jones movie. Now don't get me wrong, I don't support the trade and would prefer those things find their way to museums. I was only ever speculating about that anyway, usually to keep my mind occupied during the more boring parts of the drive. There are other illegal things I'd very much not want to be transporting on a more moral level. I know better now, and besides, they were paying me specifically not to know what was in the packages I was delivering. And boy do they pay. The thing is, I'm hardly ever at home. I paid off my mortgage the first year. The only expenses I really pay are property taxes, housekeeping services, insurance, and utilities. That means the paychecks just keep stacking up in my account. I thought about investing in stocks or something. I mean, if you've got money, you can leverage it to make more money. But I'm in no rush. I don't think I'll be needing to invest. I have no concern about making more money than I've already got. In fact, it's piling up so fast that I thought I might start buying up more houses. Not as real estate investment, not at first. The idea was I'd buy a house in different parts of the country, and if I were in the state on a weekend trip or something, I could stay at that house while I was out on my route, just for the comfort of it. I'd also be something like a security blanket. If I ever did quit or lose this job and didn't want to travel anymore, I could pick my favorite place to live and sell the other houses, which would most certainly appreciate faster than the rest of my savings account interest ever could. So that's why I'm perfectly content with being a delivery driver. You know what? I enjoyed the driving too. It's a nice perk. You might think long distance driving all day must be a terrible bore that wears you out. And that's partly true, I won't lie, but in my opinion, the sights I've seen make it all worth it. I get off the main freeway a lot too, so it's not like it's just long distance trips you're trying to finish as fast as possible. I see grand sights, the Columbia River Gorge at sunset in autumn, and the Grand Tetons at dawn. The New York skyline from all the bridges, the lights of LA at night from the Hollywood Hills, and so on. It's the subtle stuff, though, that makes your heart ache. I remember a curving, winding road going over rolling hills in Nebraska with pretty little farmhouses around each bend. An old barn in Vermont with the fog growing in sheets on the low ground at dusk. The view from a recently plowed road in the high Cascades where the peaks surrounding you were covered in such fresh snow that it looked like marshmallow fluff. A great fault block mountain rising out of the barren flatlands of eastern Oregon, so high, so wide, it generated its own rich ecosystems. A little old mining town in West Virginia where all of the buildings were so old they all had historical provenance. Not because they're preserved by historical societies, but because they've been well used and maintained by the people that love them. A lightning storm at night in rural Louisiana that seemed to roll on for infinity. I thought about getting a little dashboard camera and recording my trips. I guess that's what led to it all unraveling. I'd forgotten I'd bought the thing online on a whim from a hotel room until I found it among the unusual stack of packages on a trip home. By then, I'd set the idea aside as rather pointless. I'd never find the time to edit such a video anyway, let alone watch it. The scenery I had always enjoyed was going to be a fleeting moment enjoyed spontaneously and maybe again in memory. A dash cam would never really recapture the moments. So then I started thinking about what else I could use the little camera for. I guess it was always a dumb idea. Now that I look back, I don't know why I thought of it in the first place. I had the camera, I had the car, I had the mysterious packages in the trunk. I'm not going to say I never thought about opening the packages. It was sort of like being at some kind of console at work, with a big red button, and your boss tells you that no matter what, never push the big red button. Sure, you wonder what would happen. That temptation, though, never came close to breaking my will, or at least my will to keep getting paid so well. I guess that's why I put the camera in the trunk, along with a floodlight. I could study the package without actually opening it. That's what the contract said, after all. I was supposed to keep the package in the trunk and I was not supposed to examine its contents. It never said anything about the exterior. It never said anything about not having cameras in the trunk. I know now that must have been some sort of loophole my employers had never really considered. I suppose in the future they will fill that loophole up. I only found the loophole by dumb luck. I never really used the car's navigation system. I always had a great sense of direction, and I'd go over all the directions to my destinations from the luxury of my hotel room the night before. So, the large monitor on the dash of my luxury car seldom displayed anything but the station ID of the radio channel or the title of the audiobook I was listening to. So, I ran a USB cable from it, all the way to the trunk, through the back seats to the console. The video feed showed up at the push of a button on my steering wheel. I immediately wondered why I even bothered. On the first trip I checked and it was exactly what I'd expect. A view of my trunk, 12 packs of Coke, my toolbox, and the package. All exactly as I had left it. I think I remember feeling embarrassed, so I turned off the feed. I turned it back on the next few deliveries and each time was the same. So I almost forgot I'd even bothered in the first place. It was some time later, I don't remember exactly how much, but I was on the road to Spooner, Wisconsin. I was scrolling through my media during one of those boring stretches. I came to the trunk cam feed and paused because something felt off. I'm not sure why, I just felt the little hairs on my arms raise up. It was an instinctual sort of feeling. Now that I look back, I wonder if it was the instinct that led me to put the camera in the first place. Or something else. I kept the feed on as I drove and kept glancing at the screen suspiciously. My first thought was that there was some kind of light out. It looked shadowy somehow, except that didn't make any sense. There was only one light in the trunk, the floodlight I had put on a hook on the ceiling of the trunk. It was bright as it had ever been, except in the spot by the package I was carrying. I couldn't figure it out. I kept driving and I kept my eye on it, and it kept getting darker and darker. Then I noticed the spot on the package itself. It was sort of the reverse of a light from a flashlight, a spot of darkness if you will, round and fairly distinct if not sharp, and it grew. It grew sort of like a tumor, like you might imagine a small melanoma on pale skin, getting bigger and bigger. It grew until the whole package was very dark despite the light. I kept trying to think of a reasonable explanation. Camera artifacts, digital compression, LED branding glitches, but nothing really explained it. Then it got blacker. The total absence of light, it was like a package wrapped in a black paper. It was like some kind of hole in 3 dimensions, matching perfectly the length, width, and height of the package. I felt sure if I could change the position of the camera, the hole would change with proportions of the package. I almost wanted to pull over and open the trunk to see it with my own two eyes, but now I was way too close to the delivery site, so I waited and I drove another 20 miles or so. I turned the feed off because I couldn't handle the temptation, and I quite frankly didn't want to see what the heck was going on. When I finally stopped and popped the trunk, the package looked exactly like it was supposed to. Brown paper wrapping, the kind of clear tape with the little parallel strings running through it. An address label with my company's letterhead on it. The man who signed it was an older man living in what looked like a vacation cabin on a lake. He seemed no different than any other customer. He gave me another package to deliver, this one to Minnesota. If he noticed me acting strange, he didn't let on at all. One of the more personal things about this whole experience was that I was honestly disturbed how quickly I accepted it all. I used to be a rational, logical, scientifically minded person. Now, within the span of literally an hour, I had accepted the paranormal wholesale. Everything I understood about the world was thrown out the window. I kept expecting my phone to ring, a company representative calling me to tell me about my position being terminated, but they somehow just physically knew that their cover had been blown. I had a very restless night that night in my hotel room in Minneapolis. I thought my life was in danger. I was dealing with something far beyond my mortal understanding. No one ever came though. No one ever called. No demon teleported behind me and stole my soul. I don't think my employers even know. Like I said, I think I found a loophole they never considered. The next several deliveries did nothing unusual. Most don't. I don't think it's because of any of these packages are, normal. No, I think it's the opposite. It's just whatever's wrong with them isn't always visible. When I do see something strange, it's always different. One delivery in New Mexico started bulging outwards like it was breathing in and out for hundreds of miles. There was another package, a small one that almost bulged out, but instead of the entire surface bulging out, it was only like little dimples that would move around in certain areas. Sort of imagine like fingers or something like that trying to press out, only they moved in no pattern of a hand. There was one package that turned itself over and over, like a rectangular opaque hamster ball, but they never moved once from its original position. There was another one that floated. Whenever I braked or turned corners, it would drift in the appropriate direction, then drift back. There was one that burst into a flame. It was small at first, the same flame about the size of a lit match. It grew though, and slower than you would have expected from a paper-wrapped package. By the time half of the package had ignited, the trunk was filling with smoke. I should have been able to smell it, but somehow I just didn't. A few miles later, and it was fully engulfed. I could hardly see the flames through the smoke. In time, the camera went fully black. That was the only time I ever stopped a car to check. I opened up the trunk and the package, and everything else was perfectly normal. I grabbed a Coke out of the case, just for cover, just because, I had a strange feeling I was being watched. One time, a package started to turn itself inside out. I saw bubble wrap just before I turned off the feed. I don't know if that counted as inspecting the contents of the package, but I didn't want to risk it. I never turned the feed on again until that package had been delivered. I'm not trying to be facetious or do some sort of unknowable cosmic horror thing. I literally just can't describe it, but here is my best attempt. The package flattened out like the scent of fresh strawberries. The package upwised ponderously like a green barnacle. The package integrated an overripe mirror. It's like I have explanation aphasia. I have a real conundrum here. There's a part of me that wants to quit, put in 2 weeks' notice. Thank you, it was nice working for you, then retire in some mansion on a tropical island and never worry about it again. A part of me wants to know and see through this though. I'll never have a connection to the paranormal again. How can I live with myself if I leave now without understanding? I think if I just keep going, it's all going to come to a head at some point anyway. It's starting to leak out. The supernatural. I don't know if it's just in my head or if it's a world of itself. I don't know if I am somehow being enveloped by it. As far as I know, my employers still have not noticed. Sometimes when I'm driving in the dark at night or in stormy weather, I'll see a pair of headlights, perfectly normal headlights, except there's no car behind them. They'll move around, drive like a car would. Sometimes they come in the opposite direction and they're gone in a flash. Sometimes they're in another lane, going the same direction, and then they'll be overtaking you and disappear. It's very hard to explain. I don't know what they are, and sometimes I see freeway exits that aren't supposed to be there. Exit 189 Airport Way, exit 190 Martin Luther King Way, exit 191 Commercial Street, exit 828761 Tannhauser's Crypt. I haven't taken any of those exits. I keep going, and I'm getting more tempted, but I'm terrified of what I'll discover on them. There's a radio channel I've discovered, AM band. If I'm able to find it, it's usually the same frequency, wherever I am in the country. That shouldn't be possible. It's one of those evangelical channels, fire and brimstone type preachers. It's playing 24 hours a day, the same guy non-stop, no commercials. He hardly takes a breath. He likes to preach about damnation and eschatology, weird people names and places from all over from extinct languages. When he quotes Bible verses, they're usually verses that aren't actually in the Bible, at least from no canon that I know. I check in the Bibles in hotel rooms every night, and I'm pretty sure I'll start finding them someday, I guess, but not in the versions of the Bible that are provided to us. Something has to happen. I can quit the paranormal, and it will still be there. My employers can discover and close the loophole, or something else. Maybe something worse than my employers finding me will happen to me. It's all very distracting. I think that's part of the reason I don't remember where I am when I wake up. It's not always just restless sleep. I think I'll wake up in a place that doesn't really exist someday. It's like the whole world, or at least my world, is coming apart at the seams. I wonder, what would happen if I installed a microphone?
My Ouija Mistake by Louis M. At about the age of 10, my friends recommended having a Ouija board session during a sleepover, as one does at that age. But the results were actually quite disturbing, at least for me. I need to touch base with them and find out what their experience was. The actual Ouija session was pretty anticlimactic, but as the story goes in hindsight, we may have opened a gateway. I'll tell the portions that scared me silly and brought a feeling of terror to my soul. One day I was sitting on the couch watching TV alone while my dad was out, guarded by my best friend, Mia, a 60-kilogram Rottweiler that I still miss to this day. He was my best friend. Dad even paid $2,000 in the 90s to fix his right side with steel pins after a car hit him. I'm getting off track. But while I was sitting there, the door in the central part of the 150 to 200-year-old house swung open by itself. No big deal, right? Except this door needed the weight of somebody very strong knocking into it to open it properly, due to it being so old and rusted over time. I got up and closed the door again, shoving it accordingly. It swung open again, which piqued my curiosity somewhat. Given the nature of the door, I got back up, did the door thing again, and decided to lock it, which involved utilizing two separate locks, one slide bolt, and a different one that was a little bit smaller on the bottom that we installed years later. I walked out of the other set of doors, which had remained closed the entire time. I approached them. The room had two doors, one left and one right. These doors open into the front part of the house. I walked down the hallway towards the back of the house, and then kept watching TV, and then the door swung open again. I was petrified at this point. The dog was howling, so I left the damn doors alone. I also began having dreams of red orbs and mysterious presences. At least, I think they were dreams, because at the same time, they felt so terrifyingly real. One of the scariest parts of everything that happened after this Ouija board experience was this entity that I guess most people would call a ghost runner. It's not a silly 80s ripoff movie if that's what you think of. But, honestly, I would see this figure, and it would always be running away from me, into the darkness, almost like it wanted me to chase it. I never did. I just knew that if I did, it would end up very bad for me. Ouija boards are not a game. By Trinity R. Hi, Swamp Dweller and listeners. If my story makes it to your page, I would be very grateful. I'm not exactly sure where to start. I think the main encounters I want to discuss are the night terrors. I apologize if anything is rambled or jumbled.
I'm not sure if I have an attachment from messing with Ouija boards so much or something else. It's been happening for about 4 or 5 years at this point. When I get severe night episodes that feel like something physically heavy is holding me down, as accurate as a physical person, as real as you and I'll be in what feels like a wholly awake and conscious state when this occurs. And in most of these episodes, it feels like someone is crawling or lying on top of me. Sometimes they've done worse. Once I had one where I woke up. For brief context, we had a bad mouse infestation at the place we lived at the time. I felt like something was licking the back of my shoulder. I was sleeping on my side with my back facing the empty side of my bed. I brushed it back like a mouse to shoo it away. When I moved back my shoulder, I felt physical facial features, a head, and a vast, fat giant body laying against me. It was terrifying. They're usually terrifying. I'm not and have never been a religious person, but the one thing that seems to prevent them or keep them away is praying to Jesus before bed and until I fall asleep. That part weirds me out. I guess I'm writing this to you now to see if anyone has ever had a similar experience. I don't know how to determine what to call these episodes. Everything I read about night terror says people never remember them in detail for more than a day afterward. And it doesn't really match sleep paralysis because I can usually move, scream, and pray when they happen. As I mentioned above, it feels like I'm entirely conscious. Most of the time my eyes are closed, but everything else feels awake. I'm staring at the back of my eyelids when these episodes occur, usually when I'm trying to go to bed or early in the morning between 3 or 4 a.m. This is my first time talking to anyone other than my therapist about these episodes. I used to be very into the paranormal. I had all kinds of experiences. I used to use Ouija boards as a kid and a young teenager, and this was almost a daily occurrence sometimes. I'm not sure if that really has any correlation. I just thought that the Ouija board may have brought on something that attached itself to me. This could all be something else. I'd love to know in the comments. I Played with a Ouija Board by Clueless Clam. So, I was living in Virginia with my parents and 2 step-siblings. We had recently moved into a newly built townhouse development. Our townhouse had 3 floors in total. The upstairs area is where the bedrooms were located. The living room and the kitchen were on the main floor, and the basement was my sister's bedroom. At the time, I was becoming increasingly more interested in the paranormal. I would watch all sorts of ghost shows on television. Eventually, I learned about what a Ouija board was. I wanted one so bad, but I knew I wouldn't have the means to buy a real one myself, and I knew my parents would disapprove. So I opted to make my own. I created a template out of a piece of cardboard, carefully replicating what a real one would look like. For the planchette, I used a square-shaped plastic lid that was about the perfect size. I heard it was not safe to use it by myself, and I didn't have any friends in the area then, so I asked my sister if she would try it with me. She was initially reluctant, but after some convincing, she was game. Our uncle had recently passed away a few months prior, so we decided to try and contact him. We set the board up in the basement, which was her bedroom, with a picture of her uncle next to us. We both lightly put our fingers on the makeshift planchette, and I began to ask questions like, "Uncle, redacted, are you here with us tonight?" To both of our surprise, it took a little while to get a response. The planchette moved to yes with force. At first I assumed that my sister was messing with me, but soon I would be proved wrong because she started crying very hard. After a few more questions with responses, my sister informed me that she wanted to stop. I don't remember what else we asked because it was so long ago, but I do remember that the planchette would move with haste after every question we asked. We ended up informing her quote-unquote uncle that we were leaving and moving the piece to goodbye. Afterward, it took some time for my sister to calm down, and I was pretty blown away by the experience. Strange things started happening to me almost immediately after. After we had finished using the board, we both went upstairs to calm down and watch television together. At least 30 minutes later, I began to hear a banging noise coming from the basement. I went downstairs to investigate and found that the planchette had moved from goodbye to no, and a picture on the wall had fallen. This disturbed me, so afterward I opted to tear up the board and throw it away altogether. After I did this, I assumed that would be the end of it, and for my sister, it was. But for myself, I didn't know that this was just the beginning of months of pure terror for myself. Whatever this thing was attached to me, and my sister didn't have any odd occurrences afterward. Meanwhile, I started noticing strange things happening. It started small at first. I saw our family dogs would suddenly refuse to come into my bedroom. I would pick him up and take him into my room, and he would just try to scratch and leave the room the entire time like he was terrified, and would always act just overall strange in here. His ears would stick straight up, his eyes would fixate on a particular corner of my room, and he would whine and bark, and occasionally his head would dart around like he was watching something moving around at an erratic speed. Then I was sitting in my room another day all by myself. I was watching TV and laughing at the show I was watching. My school binders were seated at the foot of my bed, and I was sitting at the head of my bed a reasonable distance away. One of my binders suddenly slides across my bed, hitting me in the arm. This freaked me out, and I informed my parents, but they told me I must have been imagining things. Weird things like this kept happening, but eventually they would escalate to be a bit more brutal and forceful. I continued to experience things like this, and they became more and more frequent. I talked to my sister, and she told me nothing odd was happening to her. I was a mess at the time. I did not want to go home and would often try to go to a friend's house after school instead, which most of the time didn't work out. I talked to my parents again, and they thought I was making it up for attention. After a couple of weeks of going through it, I had the most terrifying night of my life. This event in particular still sends shivers down my spine when I think of it. It truly traumatized me, and although I've worked past it and talked about it in therapy, I still try not to think about it for the most part. I've only told a few people about this because it sounds like a lie. This night was the climax of my experiences, if you will. After this happened, the activity completely stopped altogether. One night, I was lying in my bed. It was 2 or 3 in the morning. I couldn't fall asleep for whatever reason, so I was lying there. My whole family was likely asleep at the time, and the house was completely dark and silent. I slept with my door open at the time, and the only light source was a blue light emanating from the radio in my room. It was just bright enough to illuminate my room enough to see where I would be walking in the dark. I had my blanket over my head, covering half of my face, but I could still see my room from waist height down to the floor. To my horror, as I lay there with my eyes open, a black figure entered my field of vision near the foot of my bed. It was right next to my bed. There was no color on whatever this thing was. It was pure pitch black, with no apparent features. I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't scream or move. I just lay there watching this thing slowly move down my bed until it stopped right in front of my face. I then felt the hand placed on my head through the blanket over me. The hand rested there for a second and then began moving in a circular motion for a few seconds. Eventually the hand lifted, and I watched the figure slowly move away and out of my room. This is the last thing that ever happened. After that, it stopped as fast as it started. This whole ordeal had a significant impact on my life. This is the first time I'm sharing this story online or on a podcast. I haven't tried until now because I did not want to type it out or relive it. But now I am more curious as to what the hell happened and what that thing was. I think I should also add that aside from the anxiety and depression issues, I am mentally sound. I have never experienced hallucinations or delusions, and I know what happened to me was real. I am sharing this with the Swamp Dweller show, not only to share my story, but also gain insight from others. What do you think this could have been? Could it have been a demon or some other entity? Has anyone ever heard of this or had any similar experiences? Back in the summer of 2016, my spouse and I were looking to buy our first home in Idaho, where we had recently moved. We live in a valley in the mountains of northern Idaho, on the border of Washington and Idaho. The house we were looking at wasn't quite what we were looking for, as we were most interested in buying a home on acreage, but had been unable to find one in our price range. Keep in mind that this was before COVID spiked up home prices to astronomical levels, which is a horror story in itself.
The house we were looking at was priced around $105,000, which was a rather attractive price for the tiny small-town home we were looking at. It was located on a corner right across from the street from the elementary school, and was quite ideal for us as we had 2 young daughters. When we arrived at the home, the real estate agent was not there yet, so we just waited outside of the home. The exterior was rough and needed some painting as the white paint had faded and peeled in several places. I remember the back porch also had a broken board that would need replacing. When the real estate agent arrived, we went into the home together and began to look around. The first floor was recently updated throughout. The floors were new, the kitchen looked nice, and the bathroom fixtures were stunning and modern. The 2 bedrooms were relatively small though. However, we heard that this home also had a basement, and that had us excited, especially since there was an old wood stove down in the basement that had previously been used to heat the home. I was happy to see it. When I turned to the basement, I noticed that my spouse and the real estate agent were already at the top of the stairs. They paused there for a long moment before finally going downstairs. I wondered why, but quickly followed them downstairs. I was delighted to see the wood stove immediately at the bottom of the stairs. I thought it was in a very convenient location that would serve well to heat the rest of the house. However, I noticed that the rest of the basement was not finished as I looked around. There were several rooms down there, but they were only fashioned out of brick and concrete with grimy glass windows in each room. The basement would need a lot of updating if we used it for anything besides heating the rest of the home. I followed my spouse and the real estate agent over to a room on the right. They had paused again at the rather disturbing-looking door. It was fashioned out of solid wood and iron and looked medieval. It had a small window atop with bars to look through the door into the room before entering or out from the inside. It honestly reminded me of a dungeon cell door. The handle could only be opened from the outside, and there was no mechanism to open it from the inside. This is what had stopped my spouse and the real estate agent in their tracks. My spouse tried to push the real estate agent to open the door, but he wouldn't even touch it, so my spouse had to open the door. They peered around the corner from the door, neither willing to step foot inside the room. I walked past them to see what was in the room they were cautiously viewing from the doorway. It was bare and concrete like the other rooms, except for one wall. This one wall was entirely made of what looked like painted plywood. I found that rather odd considering the walls of every other room in the basement were made from brick or concrete. The floor also had several metal anchor points, and the metal anchor points were on the ceiling as well. All these things gave us chills, and I quickly bolted out of the room, afraid that the door would suddenly shut and I would be locked in that room. We quickly exited the basement, went out to the back door, and went to the damaged back porch, and dodged the broken board before descending into the yard. We went around the side of the house and explored a rather dusty and junk-filled garage that sat next to and behind the home. There wasn't anything interesting in there to note about. After that, we went our separate ways. Once we were in the car, my spouse and I talked about how creepy the home was. They told me that when they had stood at the top of the basement stairs and looked down into the darkness below, they had seen 2 pairs of white eyes looking up at them. Once they turned on the lights, though, the eyes had disappeared. And my spouse tried to push the real estate agent back to get him to go in first, but the guy just wouldn't budge. So my spouse went down first, and the agent followed. This was when they saw the creepy door. My spouse had noticed a shelf containing some somewhat interesting choices of chemicals. These chemicals were very similar to the ones people would use when committing murders. We wondered what the house might have been used for in the past. I thought that with its proximity to the elementary school, it may have been used for some very sinister things. My spouse thought that maybe it had been a drug-running house and that prisoners of the drug lord had been chained down there in the basement and tortured using those harness points. I also wondered about that very strange wall of plywood. Why was it there? What was it hiding? Were there bodies hidden in a space behind that wall? We will never know, I suppose, as we didn't end up buying that home. We ended up having other personal issues that kept us from buying the home at the time. After several years of struggles, when we were finally looking to repurchase a home, housing prices had gone up more, and we couldn't really find anything in our price range. This was still before 2020. Sometimes I still think about that house. I wonder who bought it, what their life is like in that house, if they renovated it, or if they just used it for storage and tried to pretend it didn't exist. I had to creep out whoever ended up buying it. I mean, who wouldn't be creeped out? Years ago, I lived in a small community near the town of Gunn, Alberta. We had a long driveway that we had to walk down to wait for our school bus. This one day was when I went down alone as my brother was sick that day. I was used to the wilderness around us. Even though we could see the train tracks from our home, the highway was just past it. There were skunks, wood ducks, an occasional coyote, etc. So imagine my surprise when I got to the end of the driveway and saw a large, black wolf-like creature. I say wolf-like because this thing, it was huge. Just standing there. It was easily over 5 feet tall. Its muzzle was broader and its fur was thicker. It held its head very high, not low like you hear in a lot of encounters. It was built for pure strength and was not sleek looking at all. Now I love dogs, and I don't have a single fear of them, even if they run up to me barking. But I froze, instantly in fear. All I could do was stare and try to wrap my mind around what I was seeing. Was this an actual wolf? A hybrid? If a wolf, why was it walking down a road where so many people live? Wolves try to avoid humans usually. They usually turn tail and run away if they know that someone was around. Plus, there were no wolves around, so no pack. Only this hulking black beast. The only thing I knew was if I tried to run or go back down the long driveway, it would easily chase me down and take me out. So I just continued to stand there and stare at it. And it did the same. It felt like minutes before it turned around and slowly walked down the road into the field and then into the woods out of sight. Later that day I tried to tell my dad about what I saw, but he believed I was exaggerating quite a bit and that it was probably someone's dog that I mistook for a giant creature. It's so rare for a wolf to be so close to people, even rarer that it was a black wolf. But this was no dog. To this day I still wonder how close I could have actually been to being attacked or even worse, killed by this werewolf creature. A long time ago, I lived in a small town called Payson, Arizona, and would frequently sneak out at night and hang out with my friends at the park and surrounding woods. I would walk the town at night quite a bit. I lived near the old Winchester Saloon on Main Street, in the days before it burned to the ground. I can tell you that I was on my walk home late one night, and I saw the scariest thing I have ever seen. It was huge, covered with fur, dark, and had glowing eyes. It reminded me of animal eyes shining from a camera flash or headlights. I saw it come loping down McLean Street from the top of the wooded hill and moving quickly. It looked like a large dog or wolf but moved weird and jerky like it was hurt. However, it moved too fast to be injured. I thought maybe it was a coyote that had gotten hit by a car or something. However, when it stood up on its back legs and let out an inhuman growling scream, I did not hang out to find out what it was. I ran as fast as I could, and I would often joke about not running unless I was being chased, because I was a rather lazy guy. But I can tell you I ran. I ran to my house, which had a hefty, solid wooden door because I barely made it inside and slammed it, and threw the deadbolt just as something hard hit it. It was hard enough to rattle the stuff on the shelves on the wall. It damn near unhinged the door out of the jam. It woke up my entire family, and I got into serious trouble for sneaking out, but holy cow, did it scare me and everyone in the house. My stepdad grabbed his rifle and was going to go outside. Thankfully, my mom convinced him it was a bad idea, and he stayed indoors. It only knocked on the door one time after this, but when we looked out the window, we could see it watching the house from the bushes. I could see those glowing eyes piercing through my soul. Since then, I've been trying to convince myself that what I saw was nothing more than a desperate and hungry coyote. I don't know what the heck it was, but it scared me enough that I was home before dark until the day I left that town. Even as an adult, I would not go out after dark, even if armed. Thinking back on that growling scream and those piercing eyes sends chills down my spine, even as I write this. Hey swamp folk, sorry to cut into these horror stories that are freaking you out, but today's episode is sponsored by our good friends at HelloFresh. With HelloFresh, you get farm-fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your doorstep. Skip trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable, and that's why it's America's #1 meal kit. HelloFresh is 72% cheaper than dining at a restaurant, and is even cheaper than grocery shopping. That's money back in your pocket. HelloFresh's newest menu release includes Mediterranean recipes that are filled with fresh fruits and veggies, nuts, olive oils, and fiber-packed whole grains for nourishing balance. Look, I've been using HelloFresh for over 2 years now. Even before they started sponsoring this channel, I was a fan. And honestly, it's helped me stay on track with my meal plans when it comes to working out and staying healthy. And I highly recommend it. So what are you waiting for? Join me and the hundreds of others in the swamp today. Go to hellofresh.com/swamped16 and use code swamped16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 free gifts. Again, go to hellofresh.com/swamped16 and use code swamped16 for 16 free meals and 3 free gifts. HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. Hi, I've been listening to Swamp Dweller for about 3 years now, and I thought I would finally share my story. I live in a small town close to Area 51. Details of this story may be missing or told a little different from what I remember due to me being about 8 at the time of my encounter with the paranormal. My mom, my dad, and I were on the way home from a long trip to the mountains. We did some camping, and surprisingly nothing happened while we were camping. The crazy encounter actually happened while we were on the way home. We decided to drive the long way home to get a scenic route. It was dark, with no street lights, stop signs, or side streets. Just a straight road for many miles. We drove for about an hour before my mom screamed. My dad stopped the car in a panic, asking what had happened, and my mom then explained in a panicked voice, "I just saw a green flash go over the car." My dad is shaken but keeps driving, just kind of brushing it off at first. A few more miles down this dark and creepy road, and I'm just staring out my window. It is quiet, when suddenly, the green light my mother saw 10 minutes ago appears to be floating in front of the car, and the closer we get to it, the further it seems to be. My dad gasped in horror seeing the green light. Now, no one in my family is skeptical. We all believe in the paranormal, aliens, ghosts, spirits, you name it. My dad says in a spooked voice, "I think we got an alien following us." Me being 9 at the time, I was very scared and I nearly start to cry. But before I can shed a tear, the lights start bobbing up and down and getting brighter to the point where the lights are up the road in front of us. Then almost like the speed of light, it shoots its way toward our car once again and then disappears before hitting us. We didn't see the green figure or light ever again after that for the rest of the drive. But we discuss it every so often. I'm 22 now and I still wonder what we saw that night. One day at work, I and a couple of coworkers were lounging lazily outside smoking on a break. One of my younger coworkers told us this story that his dad had told him, as it happened in the recent last couple of years. He explained that his father did some type of work involving checking and diagnosing power lines for problems with electricity. At the time, he was working at a popular ski resort just a little way up the hill in a small historic town. On the evening of the incident, the ski lifts were out of order, so he was called at near dark to go check and follow the power lines to find the problem. So, he set out equipment and with a flashlight, he went and checked it out. After he checked a couple of poles and followed the lines, he sat down for a break before continuing. Once finished, he switched on his flashlight in order to see through the falling snow and darkness. In the snowbound silence, he made his way to the next pole, following the nearly invisible power lines against the black sky. As he approached the next pole,
he noticed an odd shadow behind it, dancing in the swaying beam of his flashlight. At first, he really wasn't sure what it could possibly be, but as he got closer, he began to get a feeling of dread in the pit of his stomach. The feeling grew as he started to realize that what he was seeing was a pair of legs sticking straight up out of the snow from the base of the power pole. One leg was still attached to a snowboard, while the other leg was free from the board and bent at an angle. Nothing moved. There was only stillness and silence in the snow slowly falling around him. He wondered for a few seconds what or if there was something he could do to help the victim. He decided to run up to the site and try to save the victim by digging them out by hand. He dug and dug furiously and panicked, only to realize as he dug down enough to expose half the body that he was much too late to save them. He's not sure how long he just sat there and cried, helpless to them, not even able to help them at all. Eventually he got up and went to inform the necessary people of his grisly discovery. But the staff had already known whom he had found. Apparently earlier that day, a family had reported their daughter missing to the ski resort staff after she had left the group to catch a ski lift to board back down. When she failed to return, later that night, they started to worry. The worry turned into terror after 8 hours had passed. What had happened was that on her way down the hill while snowboarding, she most likely noticed the power pole a little too late and trying to stop, falling headfirst into a tree hollow that had formed around the base of the pole. She was unable to dig herself out from being upside down, and she eventually suffocated. She managed to yank 1 foot loose from the binding on the snowboard in her desperation to free herself. That was the most terrifying part for me. I can't imagine how horrible it was to die that way. In mid-2003, I moved in with my grandparents, who essentially raised me most of my life and became more of my mom and dad than anyone else. Unfortunately, they were moving to a new house, a very dull-looking one, in a very small town. If I'm being honest, I wasn't too happy about it since there wasn't anyone my age to hang out with. Still, I made the best of it though. At least I tried to. The first week there, sometime around 1 a.m., I had woken up to go to the bathroom. And when I sat up, I felt something push me back down with force hard enough to make me bounce. Of course, me being me and dumb at the time, I immediately sat back up and looked around. But there was no one there. I didn't get out of bed either, so I lay back down and tried to go back to sleep. However, I heard a loud yowling sound that sounded like it was coming from a cat. We didn't have a cat, and I hadn't seen any strays around the house. Just a boxer that had been with us for a while, and if you're not aware, a boxer is a breed of dog. I honestly didn't know what to think, hence I pulled the covers over my head and eventually fell back to sleep. 2 nights later, I kept hearing a rocking chair always at night and randomly. Still, we didn't own any rocking chairs. After the first week, our boxer started walking upstairs every night to check on me, sometimes twice like she was making sure I was okay. I wouldn't say I liked the upstairs of that house and always had to have a light on whenever I was there. It didn't matter what room I was in up there. Fast forward 11 years. My wife and I are in the sunroom, a big room with many sunroofs and expansive windows. My mom had just passed away, and it was as if all the light in the world had faded out, and the darkness was overwhelming. A few hours after they removed her body from the home, my little niece had ran upstairs to the office for something and came running back down. My wife, who is also open to the other side, I believe she has Wiccan ancestors, told me she saw a large shadow chasing her down the stairs. After that day, the house took a much darker feeling to it, almost like the light my mom had was no longer protecting it. Now, here's the scariest part of all of this. Almost 2 years after my mom passed, my wife and I were back in that house for my dad's funeral as he couldn't live without her. He even claimed to see her everywhere waiting for him. The last night we were there, both my wife and me suffered from sleep paralysis at the same exact time. I've experienced it before, and while it's scary every time, this time was still the worst one. I saw a floating white mask whispering to me. I couldn't hear what it was saying, but I was terrified of it. It meant me harm, or wanted me to fear it. I don't know. While I was experiencing this, my wife told me she saw an older woman in the corner in a rocking chair speaking to something else in the room. She said she wasn't afraid of her. Still, she feared something else. I believe I know who this older woman was, but I don't want to put her name here.